speaker today. Our session today is titled Transparency or Map Washing, Digital Geospatial Visualization Tools in the Palm Oil Industry. We're joined by Dr. Rory Padfield, who's an Associate Professor of Sustainability and Business at University of Leeds. Much of Dr. Padfield's research has engaged with the broad themes of supply chain and natural resource governance, sustainable consumption and production, and corporate sustainability across and between different scales of business and organizations. He's especially interested in global organizational supply chains that originate in the global south, having knowledge and experience working in Southeast Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. His unique academic background spanning geography and environmental engineering facilitates a commitment to inter and transdisciplinary approaches to this research. So, Rory, thank you for being here today, and I will hand it over to you to start.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Brooke. Thank you for that introduction, by the way. Really, yes, really nicely put. And yeah, a real privilege to be able to speak today in this webinar series. I did have a look at some of the previous talks, and there's some really fascinating topics there. So I certainly encourage all of you, either online or watching on catch up, to go and have a look at those. I think that interdisciplinary question and challenge that you're trying to address here by including and inviting those that work across those different disciplines, I think there's a lot to be gained from that. So thank you again for the invitation to present. Before I get into the talk itself, and I think Brooke has provided a really nice introduction, so maybe I can skip through this slide quite quickly. I just thought it was worth positioning myself within the research, largely so that you can see where I'm coming from a disciplinary perspective. Now, that word interdisciplinary has already been mentioned quite a few times in the first couple of minutes. I think that sort of nicely represents, I think, some of the work that I do, and it represents the education that I've had to this point. So I'd call myself an interdisciplinary social scientist. I sometimes say, perhaps in a kind of more glib way, jack of all trades. Now, I don't know if jack of all trades is underselling or reflecting, again, maybe overselling exactly the extent of my knowledge, but I do feel that having a background in geography, so largely human geography, development geography, and environmental engineering. I did an MSc sandwiched between my bachelor and my PhD, has set me up quite well for the research career that I've then pursued. And I would say that having that fluidity in a way across different disciplinary boundaries has certainly, I feel, has benefited me and benefited the way that I then address some of those questions and challenges. I would say I'm not held to a particular discipline. I'm quite comfortable moving across those boundaries, as I've said. And I think for sustainability and those questions around planetary boundaries, I think we need to be moving, if we can, across those disciplines. I think there is space and there are moments where in-depth disciplinary work is required, but I think where you can move across, and if you have a background or you're looking to develop yourself, moving across different disciplines can be really beneficial. So that's a little bit about my formal education background. And just to say, in terms of positions, I've worked as a sustainability consultant. That was the first role that I took outside of following my PhD. But then I worked as a lecturer, went back to higher education, and I moved to Malaysia, and I spent 6 years in university technology in Malaysia. And that's really where I suppose I'll call it my formative, although my PhD the years before were formative, this was very much formative in my knowledge and understanding of food systems and tropical land use change. I say that I moved to Malaysia and I caught the palm oil bug, and I'm very thankful that it wasn't a real bug, but that bug for research, that kind of interest in and curiosity around this particular commodity, palm oil, and the kind of interesting questions around sustainability have remained kind of, sort of several years on. So I'm going to talk about one particular project that's linked to that. Just in terms of what happened afterwards, so I moved back to the UK. That's where I'm from. I taught geography at the University of Oxford, Oxford Brookes University, and then I moved to Leeds in 2019, where I've I'm an associate professor. This is just a picture, I think neatly sort of depicts the type of methods and the type of work that I do. Quite often, in a plantation or engaging with communities or people on the ground. This happened to be a migrant Indonesian worker who was based in Malaysia, but he was happy to share his experiences of working in that industry. So in terms of the talk then, I'm going to start with a hook, and hopefully a hook that keeps you engaged, or certainly sets the scene for this presentation as a whole. And really the slide is the project full cycle. So this is the starting point for this particular piece of research. In 2019, I received an email literally out of the blue inviting me to an in-person launch of a transparency tool or traceability tool by a very large palm oil firm. So I had a relationship with a number of different palm oil firms following that period in Malaysia. And so I must have been on an email list or something like that. But yeah, I was invited to this launch, and the launch was to showcase this new tool. And I remember at the time thinking, this is fascinating. What is this tool? How does it work? What's the data behind it? What's the purpose? This is a screenshot just showing the tool itself, and I'm going to go into this, of course, in a bit more detail. But the real question that stood out in my mind and really prompted me to pursue this further was, why was the launch taking place in the UK? There were just so many sort of questions at that point. Why is it not taking place in the country where palm oil is predominantly grown, or the regions, which is, as I'll come to in a minute, Southeast Asia. So it was really, really interesting. And I thought, right, this could be a potential project. And just to sort of go full cycle or full circle, this is just a screenshot of the final paper, or the paper. So if you are interested in this research, please do have a look at the Journal of Business Strategy and the Environment. And I'd like to acknowledge the contribution of my co-authors, so Susanna Mattor, Adam Tyson, Chi Wong, Gemma Bridge, and Alexandra Dales. So that was the team behind this piece of research, and it was internally funded through the Interdisciplinary Award at the University of Leeds. So that's the hook in a way, and I hope that you'll stay on to hear what the project actually revealed, what we found out. Just in terms of a structure, just to sort of signpost how this is going to work, or how my talk will follow. So I've got a little bit of background on sort of key concepts in the palm oil industry. I'll then cover the project aim and methods, key findings and conclusions, hopefully pretty straightforward. Okay, so the first concept I'm going to introduce is this concept of map washing. Okay, so this is new. Unless you've read the paper, and as far as I'm aware, there's no other reference to this term map washing. This is new. As I say, it's come through the result of our research. We came up with this term. And it draws on, I'm sure you won't be surprised if you're familiar with sustainability in a corporate domain. It draws on the concept of greenwashing. Greenwashing being an organization, typically a business, sometimes governments, presenting information about their environmental credentials that don't really match the reality. Perhaps it's a smokescreen, perhaps it's over-egging their activity or their accomplishments, but it's quite a well-known concept, and there's quite a lot spoken about greenwashing. Interestingly, in the last couple of years, we've seen a kind of green hushing. We've seen organizations that are doing good work actually keeping quiet about what they're doing. Now, this is a separate concept, but I just thought to almost update the slide on greenwashing to say that things are evolving and things are moving in this sphere. However, I wanted to bring this idea of map washing to you. And we define it as a selective disclosure of spatial information that has little or no value to the intended users, but rather creates, conforms to, or distorts a particular narrative. Okay, so the key information here is it's the spatial information, the disclosure of spatial information, and with that kind of critical perspective that it creates, conforms, or distorts a narrative. And the image there is just a generic palm oil landscape I'm just using it as a kind of representation, let's say, just of a spatial representation here. But this idea that it's used as a way, as a means to maybe divert attention, or it doesn't reflect reality. Okay. Now, I'm not saying necessarily that in our work we found that across the board, and we're also not talking about intentionality here. It's very difficult to get to the point of confidence around intentionality. But certainly when we look at outcomes and when we reflected on the people that we spoke to in this research, map washing seemed to chime. In terms of other background here, we see huge land use innovation. So this seminar series around planetary boundaries, thinking about different either technologies or concepts or ideas. This is an evolving space and it's moving so quickly, and I'm sure you'll be familiar with that. So everything from kind of web-based programming, satellite technology, drones, artificial intelligence as well. In terms of land use, this potentially could be groundbreaking. We could be seeing reduced impacts on the environment. We could be seeing maybe increased yields when it comes to crops. Okay, so I think there's a lot of positivity, and I think this particular presentation or this work sits within this broader sort of idea of land use innovation. But what I wanted to kind of bring to it was a kind of critical question, or certainly raise a question. Well, what are the sustainability impacts here? And we should always be, I think, raising that, or certainly with sustainability hat on, raising the question, are we seeing the right kind of impacts on the ground, whether it be for the community or for the environment, the ecology? Sometimes increasing yields may not have that same positive impact on community and the environment. So I'm raising that question straight away. The other key concept here is around transparency. Clearly, a tool that's meant to generate and improve transparency, that could be a very positive thing. And I put a question here: is it the new great hope for land use change? If we know more about the way that businesses and organisations that are involved in land use change, I'm thinking here about agribusinesses, but of course there are other organisations as well. If we know more about what's happening, surely that's a good thing. Okay, and potentially with the outcomes that are positive for sustainability, whether that's community or the environment. And I'd like to draw your attention to this notion of transformative transparency, and I'm referencing here the work of Gardner et al. 2019. And transformative transparency here means organizations that work in this context in the land use area are providing good information or accurate information about the actors in their supply chain, the activities that they're involved in on the ground, and that might be then disclosing spatial information, the sustainability work that they're doing, again, disclosing that, and that might also be kind of negative outcomes as well, but they are prepared to actually disclose that. Transformative transparency would also refer to transactions. Companies are doing business with one another. Companies, agribusiness, they're doing business with one another all the time. Are they being open about how those business operations and activities are taking place? Ownership as well, that's another one. We see in the agribusiness space sometimes the use of shell companies, so it becomes very opaque and murky to understand who is actually doing what and who is responsible for different actions. So Gardner et al. With this particular concept saying, look, if we can get to this point, if we get to a kind of more transformative level of transparency, actually, we're in a better place. It could reshape our relationship between nature and society, or certain those organizations and nature and society, and move us away from this idea of simply just accumulating capital for the sake of it. It could move us away from this idea of overconsumption or pattern of overconsumption and environmental degradation. So it's a very ambitious concept, admittedly, but I think it's an important one. The second point here is that in disclosing spatial information, we also have to acknowledge the issues, concerns around the outcome of that spatial information and who is ultimately curating and making those technologies, producing those technologies and those maps. And in spatial, when we talk about spatial transparency, ultimately we are then talking about mapping And as you'll see in a minute, that was very much the kind of core focus of our studies. We wanted to understand what are these maps that are being displayed and being disclosed by companies. Now, there's a big literature within human geography that critiques and questions these maps, looking at those original sort of colonial explorers, colonial surveyors who had power, power over the community, the environment at that time, to make claims over land, over territory. And so the point here, this literature will tell you very clearly that maps really are an expression of uneven power relations. They're an expression of value, of privilege, and of judgment. And we have to be very careful when we look at maps that what is it representing and who is being represented. And it could be that these maps actually are pushing people off the map. They're not represented. So we have to maintain that sort of critical lens when we see a map. It's not an apolitical thing. So just sort of moving a little bit towards palm oil itself and the industry and some of the issues associated with it. I won't spend too long, but for those that are not familiar with palm oil, on the left-hand side you can see the edge actually of a plantation. You can see the crop there. This was taken around 2015 at a plantation that I was very familiar with and doing some work in at the time. You can see on the right-hand side a forest that has been is actually recovering from a fire. So a fire whipped through that area and cleared off a lot of the vegetation, which is a very kind of common practice. So that's what the palm tree looks like from the ground. This is what it looks like from the air. So with a bit of elevation, with a bit of perspective from the air, you can see the scale potentially of this crop. It's associated with deforestation. It's associated with a significant land use change historically, but also increasingly in certain parts of the world. Habitat destruction. So the media will often pick on some of the big charismatic mammals such as orangutans, but of course there's plenty of other ecology, flora and fauna that's affected by this land use change when it comes to palm oil. We hear less about it, but worker exploitation is another issue that comes to mind. Mismanagement and corruption, which, let's face it, that's ubiquitous across the world in all sorts of different industries, not just to palm oil, but those are some of the representations, or let's say critical representations of the industry. On the flip side, economic growth, rural development, these are the sort of perceptions from the producing countries that you'll hear more readily. Poverty alleviation. There's a real pride actually when I lived in Malaysia for 6 years. There's a real pride in the industry and what it's done in transforming certain locations that had nothing. We see schools, we see clinics, we see services and roads quite often built by palm oil firms. So we have to be a little bit careful in the way that we kind of perceive and make judgment about an industry such as this. It's not all one side or the other. There's probably a grain of truth in all of those little points, but it's worth us certainly having a critical perspective and kind of asking questions before making judgment. In terms of the actual fruit, this is what it looks like. If you haven't seen the fruit, it has a very kind of striking orange-brown color once you've taken it off the bunch. And of course, the crop itself is used in all sorts of different food commodities, as well as biofuel and cosmetics such as shampoos and soaps. There's about 30 million hectares of palm oil currently, of which 2/3, 20 million hectares is in Southeast Asia. So yeah, 2/3 of the industry is located in Malaysia and Indonesia, but we start to see tropical parts of Africa and Latin America now coming up and developing their own industries. And we would refer to those as the frontier geography, so Africa and Latin America. In terms of the supply chain itself, so it looks quite straightforward. If you go from left to right on the screen, there's the palm crop on the left, the nice kind of little icon there. you see the truck taking it to a mill, and then it goes all the way through until it's manufactured. The issue here really is at the harvesting. So where you see the crop itself, it degrades very, very quickly. We're talking tropical climates, high humidity, high temperatures. So that crop, within 24 hours, it needs to get to a mill. And that's very, very challenging for a lot of particularly smallholders. There's a real urgency to get their crop, once it's been grown, to the mill, and they could lose out on price. A return, they'll lose out on their return for their crop if they don't do that. So there's some logistical questions there that also feed into some of the sustainability questions. So innovation, but for whom? This is the last slide before I move on to the actual study. We see huge innovation within the industry. So again, it does get criticized for its various impacts, but it's invested, the industry and governments have invested in quite huge amounts actually over the last 10, 15 years. Universities are very active, again, looking at things like ecological impacts, looking at yield, trying to improve what's already there, maximize what's already there before looking at new areas to develop, and of course the big question or the big challenge is to try and avoid those sensitive ecosystems, whether it's primary rainforest, peatlands, and areas of high ecological value. And that's really where the transparency and traceability tools come in. We've seen this proliferation of these tools, but the questions then are, well, how do they work? What is their purpose? Who and what benefits from it? And those are effectively the key questions that I'm looking at. So in terms of my own project then, it was a what, why, and for whom of DGVs, digital geospatial visualization tools in the palm oil industry. These are the three objectives. There we go. Three objectives of the study. I wanted to know the purpose, scope, and scale of these tools. I wanted to examine the sustainability impacts and the outcomes of the tools, and then to reflect on broader contributions to innovation and sustainability more generally. Okay, so those were the three objectives that really held us to account throughout the project. In terms of a definition, so two key points to note here. So whilst looking and trying to identify these tools, we needed to find tools that the palm oil firms themselves had developed. So just like I mentioned right at the beginning, I was invited to a launch by one particular firm. These were the sorts of tools we're interested in. We weren't interested in tools that they were creating just for internal use. Okay, we probably wouldn't be able to access those anyway. We needed to access those tools that were externally facing, produced by the firms themselves. And, it didn't matter if they had collaborated with others, let's say a satellite technology firm, to support the tool. They needed to be owned by the firm themselves, and it needed to include a map. That was the key thing. And that's really the distinction in a way with other CSR reporting, which tends to be text-based, maybe a few images, a few videos here and there. It needed to include a map. And that was what we were seeing. We were seeing this trend towards the spatial representation. So we were looking explicitly for these things. And those maps needed to identify a number of kind of key points about the firm's activities, whether it's plantation sites, the mills, refineries, but also other data, whether it was soil types, land use ownership boundaries, conservation status, that sort of thing. In terms of the methods, there were 4 phases. Once we'd defined our scope, which effectively was the definition in a way of DGVs, and we'd identified those DGVs that we were then going to assess, we then assessed them, we undertook some interviews, and we then analysed across the data sources that we had, so the interviews and the DGVs. So just in summary, well, it was 17 interviews with a range of different stakeholders who had knowledge or interest or a stake in these tools, including palm oil producers themselves. And then we analysed 97 different firms, and we used the Sustainable Palm Oil Policy Transparency Toolkit, otherwise known as SPOT, if you're familiar, and they do an annual assessment of all palm oil firms. We used their database in effect to kind of identify who the firms are, and then we did our own assessment once we had the information. So what were the key findings? So we created a typology of these DGVs, and we found there were 3 levels. There was a basic transparency, level 1, a moderate transparency 2, and then level 3 was a good transparency. And I'm just going to show you very quickly levels 1 and 3. Level 1, basic transparency, was effectively a very flat map. Sometimes it was a PD, like a screenshot, just like I'm showing you here. Very limited interactivity, no depth to the information provided, maybe some data points, so perhaps a list of mills, refineries, perhaps some company names, but quite opaque, very high level, no description of land types. So we weren't clear, let's say, whether it was a peatland soil, which has high ecological value. We had no understanding of the user or ownership models. We didn't know about the environments. It was very much just like pins and dots on a map. And this is a representation of one of them. All the way through to good, what we called good transparency, or level 3, which was a much higher level of interactivity. So the data points were mapped, including things like the smallholders that are then providing the fresh fruit bunches, the FFB, to the mills. They would provide geo coordinates, so you could really go in and see, right to the kind of detail, very, very granular, I would say, that the data points that were being mapped. There was a fantastic scale perspective, and I could appreciate this as a geographer. You could zoom in, you could zoom out, so you could use the different functionalities of the tool to really go in and understand how that what that plantation or what that mill looks like potentially within a landscape. There were limitations to that. I'll come to that, but that was certainly a big plus. Then sustainability information was provided. So things like the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, so that's the global, almost like a global certification body. That information was provided, and links to those certification records, and links to other types of business operations as well. So if it was owned by another company, that was really helpful because you could then go and follow the link. There were options to integrate land types, so you could see what kind of soil it was sat on. Maybe concession areas, so that's areas that were the areas that are owned by that particular company, so they might actually put the boundaries out, the conservation status, and one in particular linked to a grievance case register. So where community groups were unhappy, there might be a grievance going on in the background, and there would be a little bit of information about what the grievance was and any kind of sort of status updates on that grievance. And this is just a screenshot of a representation of the sort of that level of detail that was provided. So again, the red here represents the smallholders that are supplying the mill, which you can see is the red dot towards the bottom left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, you can see that reference layer that gives you information on endemic bird areas, key biodiversity, protected areas, so forest, intact forest landscapes, etc., etc. So a much more detailed. You can see the scale and resource that's really, or the thinking that's gone into actually providing that level of information, which was great. And that's just to compare back to level 1. You can see the difference between the two quite clearly just in two clicks. In terms of how did it look across the industry as a whole? So as I said, we looked at 97 firms, and what was interesting was that the firms that had invested were only small in number. So we only found 16 firms that actually invested in a DGV. So that's quite a small number. What's that? Nearly 16%, right? Or nearly 20%. However, their land bank was a third of the total land bank of those firms that we looked at. And that's quite significant. If you look at the average land bank, therefore, per firm with a DGV, it's over 200,000 hectares, compared with, so the third line there, or the sort of second main row, is that firms that don't choose to invest, right, they are larger in terms of the total land bank, but actually smaller when it comes to an average. So effectively, if you're a large firm, you're more likely to invest in a DGV, right? And in terms of their locations, those firms that were large enough, or the big ones that invested, most of them were located in Southeast Asia. They didn't. They had smaller operations in these other frontier areas, whereas these other firms that didn't invest, they did have some representation in Southeast Asia, but they tended to also have representation in other parts of the world, including, of course, Central and West Africa and Latin America. So you can draw, we do draw a few conclusions about why that is the case, but certainly to describe those results, it's important to note that it's the larger firms, potentially those that are much more visible from a sustainability point of view, as in people are looking at them, they're the ones investing, rather than the smaller firms that are working in frontier areas. So why, our question then was, why use a DGV? Why invest in a DGV? And to answer that, there's two slides here, or two questions. First of all, it's understanding the audience. Who the audience is. So we derive this really through the interviews. And there seem to be three main audiences. First of all, it's the buying and sourcing companies, which does make sense. So the business to business, essentially, within the industry. So those that are looking to buy from those big firms, they're the ones that are actually or potentially using these tools. NGOs, a third sector and not for profit. So again, their involvement really is kind of scrutinizing to a certain extent, or evaluating and presenting information for the media, for the public. So they're another one who are potentially using these tools. And then thirdly, government agencies. Not necessarily because it's a policy requirement, but they're almost sort of keeping an eye, and therefore the industry is kind of presenting that information for sort of accountability purposes, I suppose. Why use DGVs beyond then the audiences? So we felt that really they were an expression of corporate engagement, investment, and a legitimacy kind of angle. So it's sort of showcasing, look, we're interested in doing things better. We might have a bit of a difficult past and history when it comes to land use change, but we're trying to do things better and differently now. So it's a kind of legitimacy argument. However, when you kind of dig down a little bit, you see that these tools aren't integrated very well within existing management systems. They're effectively kind of interesting side projects. They are not driving change. They're very much kind of bolt on the side. And as I mentioned, these then it begs the question: are they then a response to these historical campaigns against the firms? That's a question mark there. We didn't have anything conclusive on that, but it was raised through the interviews. The second use then was around internal risk management. It was very interesting that one of the firms said, well, we invested all this resource, we produced this tool, and actually we found it really useful because we could identify risks within our own supply chain. So they were kind of admitting they had a bit of an external audience initially. That was the main goal, but they found it really useful internally to kind of identify where there were problems. And then thirdly, why use DGV? Well, certainly as a communication tool. So the very fact that presentation that I mentioned, that launch event, was in London, I think that's key here, that there's a communication objective here about the tool. So you could say, well, is it just parked alongside other types of corporate communication tools that they have? I think it goes further than that potentially, but certainly the questions that are being asked by NGOs, they can respond to that. They can communicate to these criticisms or questions. Say, look what we're doing, and as I say, Spot that do this annual evaluation, WWF, Greenpeace that ask questions. They can actually say, look what we're doing in this space. In terms of impacts on sustainability, unfortunately, it was really, it's a bit of an slightly dissatisfactory to say, we couldn't come up with one kind of big point here, but really from our side, not being able to visit these sites on the ground, this research happened during COVID, meant it limited what we could do. But from our interviews and from our assessment of the tools, we felt there were many uncertainties. We didn't feel like it was driving necessarily big change. It may kind of instigate further questions internally, but certainly there were many uncertainties. We couldn't say conclusively, yes, the environment in these places is improved, or we're seeing less impact in these areas because of the tool. So I think for us, we had to make a point that actually there's a lot of uncertainty over the impact of the tools. And importantly, and this is a really key point, social issues were largely excluded. So other than those firms that they would identify grievance issues and actually display those grievance issues with communities, the community voice and the human voice is almost completely absent. And this is a photograph I took of the same guy actually that I was interviewing. His voice and his family's voice, the communities that live close to or affected by palm oil, they are not represented on these maps. And that clearly posed some questions and was quite thought-provoking for us. Of course, there's data collection challenges. If you're engaging with people, there's going to be consent, accessibility, confidentiality. Potentially, if somebody did get, if their voice was captured and somehow displayed on these tools, could there be recriminations for that person? Could they lose their job? Could it be worse than that? So I appreciate there are some complexities here, but almost in most cases, there were no kind of community voices or human issues included in the maps. And yeah, a point that Greenpeace made, maybe if you add in those community voices, it could lead to more criticism. So companies prefer to stay hidden. So yeah, that was one point made. And coming towards the end now, in terms of land use change, and of course that's a big theme for the webinar series as a whole. What's interesting when you look at these tools, and perhaps it's no big surprise, there's a real linear focus on supply chains. Okay, so from production all the way through to the production of the crop through to kind of export in a way. There's not a focus on the wider systems. And I think when we reflect on sustainability, when we reflect on food systems, we're moving away from this idea of just thinking about the kind of linear A to B. We're looking at all of those different connections and relationships. So yeah, very negligible representation of wider impacts or relationships. So whether it be downstream, whether it be in that catchment, the local economy, culture, food insecurity. There's research that says that bringing palm oil into an area can impact on food security for those communities living nearby. No reference to that. It's completely absent again from the maps. And this, yeah, so this is a representation of a linear supply chain, kind of clean in a way. It's kind of straightforward. You produce your crop and then you go through a series of steps. A food system, okay, is complex, and it's good that we can appreciate that and we can see that. And I'm not necessarily saying that all of these things would be on the maps, but the way that the maps are representing what is a complex issue, they're really reducing it down to kind of almost the bare minimum. So you start to question the kind of efficacy and the usefulness then of these tools. So I would like to get to the Q&A, so I'm just going to move on. These are the last two points really. When reflecting across the board, what matters here? What does it all mean? Okay, I've almost answered my question here. As a geographer, it's no surprise that I would say geography matters. I think we see this spatialization of corporate storytelling. It provides a sophistication that we don't see in other types of CSR reporting. So whether it be text-based or other types of just standardized reporting. This is bringing it to a new level, and I would refer to Gardner's transformative transparency. Perhaps we are moving from a kind of placeless transparency, which was the critique of previous transparency initiatives, much more towards situated. So I think there's a lot to be gained by actually getting that granular detail and understanding what's happening on the ground and getting that kind of actor-based and environmental, social information if it's possible, right? So I think there's a lot to be said. I think it leads to improved sense making of the industry and the challenges that the industry faces. And I think in a way then that does support legitimacy and credibility. So I think there's a lot of positives there in bringing that sort of spatial representation of the industry. But as I mentioned previously, geography doesn't matter to all producer firms. And I think that's a really important question. Why is it that it's only the larger firms operating in the kind of main areas the known areas of palm oil where it's regulated more closely. Those areas, those frontier geographies, are not seeing the same level of investment. Why is that? What's happening there? And then finally, of course, I've introduced this argument of map washing right at the beginning, and that's really our kind of where we're going with this, or certainly the big contribution, or one of our contributions to knowledge. I think map washing could be used as a means to carefully control that corporate communication of what the company is doing. That clean and sanitized representation of messy and complex interactions is problematic and needs to be called out, I think. It sets particular imagery of business operations in these spatialized supply chains. The companies themselves, they can set that imagination for us. It's not up to us in a way, or we have very limited information of what's happening in these rural geographies. But I think if we rely just on these maps from these firms, we get very particular, clean, sanitized representation that doesn't represent actually what's happening on the ground. And I think the social experiences, that's a concern, that they are missing. That we don't see the voices of people on these maps at all, and blurring out catchment issues. So whether it be pollution, food insecurity, again, these are all absent and concerns for us. Transactions between firms also absent. So that was the kind of almost the key points around map washing. I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about, well, how can we mitigate this? Some of our suggestions are around regulation, collaboration between organizations to come up perhaps with a guideline and a blueprint. I'm sure there'll be people saying, oh, not another set of regulations, another guideline. But in a way, when a new tool like this comes up and we see these new tools in all sorts of different areas emerging, suddenly all sorts of practices happen, and it's a bit of a wild west. And I think we are seeing that in this space. So some nice collaboration between organizations would be good. I think also collaboration, given the investment that these firms are putting in, also demonstrates their commitment towards the sort of planetary boundaries. Rather than as a distinguisher, let's invest to distinguish ourselves to our competitor. Why don't we collaborate? Because we know that ultimately planetary boundaries and keeping within those, we're not going to do that as individuals. So I think there's certainly some interesting questions on how we can kind of mitigate. Yeah, so as a conclusion, they certainly represent opportunities for transformative transparency, but we must be wary of map washing. I think participatory and wider systems approaches are future priorities, whether that's in the kind of research of these tools or the development further of these tools. And I certainly think questions around the sort of bigger questions around the relationship between innovation, corporate communication, and organizational culture are worth pursuing, not just in palm oil, but more generally. So yeah, to what extent is innovation a reflection of external communication needs or genuine interest in sustainability? So that question really sits at kind of is almost the tension here between doing something for good reason versus do we just need to communicate to some external stakeholders and keep them quiet? So where does it fit, and who or what drives investment in sustainability innovation? I think that's key. Where's the decision making coming from in a case study like this, and what does that say about where sustainability and transparency fits within, again, that decision making? There we go. I've spoken a bit too long there, but I'm hoping we've got some time for some questions.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. And we do have a couple of questions in the chat. I think you answered mine a little bit, but
Okay.
I think that Madison, do you want to take it away? Or do you want me to?
Yes, I am only seeing one question as of now from Mohammed at Technical University of Munich. Do you see other ones?
Yeah, I can see Mohammed's question.
Do you want to ask it yourself, or would you prefer that I ask, Mohammed? I'm happy to read it off for you.
Oh, there he is. Mohammed, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question, or we're happy to read it for you?
Yeah, I thank you so much for the presentation. I'll just read it. So I was just wondering, thank you so much for the presentation. Fantastic concept. I was just wondering whether map washing actually overlaps with this problem that geographic information system professionals usually refer to as the modifiable areal unit, in which you change the boundaries of things and then the resulting maps would communicate completely different stories depending on how you artificially force certain boundaries into those maps. Um,
Yeah, quite possibly. I'm not familiar with this modifiably aerial unit problem. So that's thank you for raising that. I'm not familiar with this term. I'm just trying to get a sense to changing the artificial boundaries in a map. Perhaps at a kind of conceptual level, changing information about how information is situated in a map. Uh, Possibly yes, but I think it's more than that. I think kind of map washing is more sort of sitting back and looking, well, what information is being presented and why is it being presented in a particular way? Is it to conform to a particular narrative? Is it to distort? Is it to kind of um, is it presenting information that doesn't accurately represent a whole series of other things that are going on, not just, let's say, what is happening on that particular ground, but maybe transactions between different organizations. It's cleaning it out essentially. At that point, just sanitizes it. There's just kind of nothing there. So I do think it does relate to that concept or that idea, that
mhm,
this idea. I'd need to look into it though.
mhm. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Scott, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I guess thanks for that talk, Rory. That was
Okay.
that was really interesting. Yeah,
Oh,
I'm an Earth observation scientist at Montana State, and yeah, I've spent most of my career making maps and using remote sensing and geospatial analysis to develop maps. And so I was attracted to this talk because
mm,
I like this idea of map washing, and I kind of wanted to learn more about it. And it's interesting, like our fields overlap in a lot of ways, but
mm,
we use different terminology as well. So maybe sort of following up on Mohammed's
yeah.
question, I think a little bit, if I can sort of, you know, intuit where Mohammed might be going with his question, but I had a more general question just about sort of map validation. Because as somebody who
Mm,
makes maps, I know how much error goes into maps and how it's when you're mapping land cover and land use change, there's a lot of inaccuracies. So like I really appreciated that last map you showed of like the expansion of palm oil and you had all those nice red polygons.
yeah.
My mind obviously just goes to like, well, why do we assume that that map is accurate? So I
Mm,
thought that map washing was going to be more about sort of like masking inaccuracies in maps.
mm,
And so I thought it was interesting how you presented like, well, here's transparency as sort of the gold standard, right?
mm,
What point is like validation or verification of
yeah.
the alleged transparencies and information presented on maps a part of it?
Yeah.
And you talk about all these other like social constructs that you would like to see mapped. And could you imagine the inaccuracies in mapping that kind of stuff?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
hard enough to just map like deforestation or palm oil expansion
Yeah.
or regrowth. Like when you start mapping social dimensions, it becomes much more complicated. So I'm just curious, like your perspective on validation,
Yeah.
accuracy assessment, and how that fits into this concept of map washing.
Yeah. It's a really good point. Thank you for your question, Scott. I think we asked the question of how of the palm oil firms and some of the technology providers who support palm oil firms to create these maps. And they said, well, because there's no formal process, right? It's not like they're submitting files as part of a kind of regulation where you might need a third party to come in and assess. It's up to the company to, they can choose to provide whatever type of map. And we got some real criticism of the way certain firms submit certain files in areas that they're more comfortable to disclose. So the actual concession area, so the boundaries, and they've got that all geolocated, you'll be familiar with that, but they weren't prepared to then disclose the maps, the concession maps of other areas. But there's no verifier, there's no, I don't know, third party saying, there's something inconsistent with the way that you're submitting that information. And I think that really gets at the heart of what we mean by map washing, which is, as a concept, it's not as technical in a way. We're not kind of looking at the technicalities of the map, although we are interested clearly that it's accurate. What we're interested in is the stories that it's presenting to its audiences. It's the stories. And so I take your point about the social issues. Absolutely. I mean, it's in a way, it's far cleaner in a way to deal with an environment. Yes, an environment changes. It might be forest one day and something else another day. But when you're talking about communities and kind of how that's far harder. But I suppose we're not thinking about that. We're thinking about, well, what stories do we know and understand about that? Take that worker that I interviewed. What's his experience like at that particular point in time? Where does that appear on the map? Could it be that this very interactive style map actually has a kind of little pop-up that says, look, on this particular day we spoke to so-and-so. He's not, hasn't got a name. We're not going to give him a name, whatever. But this is his experience of this particular plantation and working with this firm. I'm not saying the company would do that, but that's a very different type of story and presentation compared to, let's say, right, let's be very accurate here and kind of show all the details. I suppose we're not going down that road.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Rory.
Okay.
Any other questions? I have a question if nobody else does, but I'd like to see if anybody else has a question.
I just had a follow-up question, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Or maybe comment more.
Sure.
So if I get this right, so map washing is about these firms cherry picking which information to map out and which information to keep for themselves, right?
Yes.
Okay. And the problem is not technical as you said. So I was wondering whether then in this specific industry you see any differences between firms on what type of information do they disclose versus not, and whether there is some element to explain that variation.
Yeah, so I think that reflects in a way in that slide around the typology. So there were some firms that were literally going to town and were almost opening up as much as I suppose they could. I don't know how far they could have gone, but almost bombarding you with information on different sources that they had, and perhaps that's where they were going. I'm not saying they had read Gardner's paper on transformative transparency, but they were really thinking, right, let's show who the interactions that we have with different companies, our model, ownership model, the sustainability standards, the intentions of our work. So, for example, the policies and how they, the actions that they take to try and meet those policies, across the board, lots of different things, versus that very flat map that just had little pins. So I guess what I'm saying is there's a huge variety. We found a variety in the depth and breadth of knowledge from these firms, and it's up to us, I suppose, to question and try and come to some conclusions around the intentionality. And we do in the paper, we talk about those bigger firms that are much more visible and are being attacked by NGOs and others, and they have to, as I say, almost they need to argue their legitimacy, versus those firms. Nobody's talking about them. Nobody knows about them. Why would they? So they can use the tools in a way to show, look, we're keeping up with a trend. But listen, we're not going to disclose our ownership model and who, our shell companies. That's not what we're up for. So, am I answering your question, Mohammed?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Well, and I kind of wondered if it had to do, and this, you're getting to this, just like the money involved in building something like this and all the data that goes into it, and those bigger corporations would have the resources to
Yeah.
make that.
And I think that's right. I think it is about investment. It's about, I suppose it's about ambition as well. So I think these things are all connected. Certainly, the more expensive or the more fancy the software, of course. I mean, perhaps Scott can help us out. The more you want to show and the more kind of interactivity on your map, the more expensive or the more data points, it's going to cost you more. You may have to have that satellite, the more expensive satellite that goes over more regularly as compared with maybe one that only goes over once a year. So maybe as a footnote, and I didn't mention this in the slide because I only found this out recently, the firm that did the big launch of that tool, they've actually taken their map offline, which is really interesting. And I was a bit of a sucker punch because I thought maybe these tools are going to kind of expand and go in a different direction. Actually, that firm that probably started it all have decided to pull back, and I'd like to know why. Because those other firms are still doing what they're doing. So I think there's some interesting questions on what the motivations are about investing heavily and then actually taking it offline.
Well, thank you so much. I have a question I'll follow up via email with you if that's okay, because we are at time. So thank you so much, Rory, for presenting today and joining us. Thank you everyone for joining us. This is our last webinar for the academic year, but we will be releasing more topics for next year based on other planetary boundaries, such as ocean and freshwater, novel entities and things like that. So please, we hope to see you again.